So just thank you, Brian Keats, for joining us and offering to provide us with some of your insights into particularly the Astro-Calendar in relation to biodynamics practice. We've got some areas, question areas, interview areas that we'd like to kind of unpack with you, and just saying up front that this is aimed to be a part of an introductory biodynamics course for Biodynamics Tasmania. And so we know there'll be lots of other areas that we could go into, but we might just kind of keep pushing those back a little bit until perhaps another interview if you're open for that. So yeah, the aim of today is really introductory stuff and trying to get our heads around, particularly for new people to biodynamics, around some of the cycles, the rhythms that are dealt with in your calendar.
Righto.
Okay. So first of all, Brian, there's clearly the cycles of the sun and those rhythms, and as I guess the broader context before we go into the lunar cycles themselves. Could you just give us a little bit of an explanation of the relationship between the cycles of the sun, the rhythms of the sun, and ultimately how they may impact on the lunar rhythms?
Sure. Well, if we understand the sun rhythms, we'll understand the lunar and planetary rhythms much more easily and more clearly. So first off, to appreciate now the where we are in the southern hemisphere, the sun has crossed the equator, which it did last month. And what we'll see is that as every day progresses, the sun will rise further north of east.
Mm-hmm.
At the equinox, it rose exactly due east and set due east. But now it's setting northeast, northwest, and we find it's getting lower and lower in the sky. That same rhythm is going to happen to the moon and the planets too, once we get a handle of the suns. So we see that's what, in biodynamics, that we call a descending rhythm. The sun is getting lower in the sky each day. It's rising further and further north of east. When we pass the next equinox in September, the sun will start to rise south of east and set south of east, south of west. Now, when we see a moon rising north of east, we know it's in the northern hemisphere. We see Mars rising north of east, we know it's over the northern hemisphere. So at the moment we see a trend that the sun's getting further and further north. It's rising further and further northeast. It's descending, it's getting lower in the sky. Then later in the next equinox, it's going to get higher in the sky. It'll be ascending and rising south of east and be over the southern hemisphere.
Right.
So those are key rhythms we'll see in the moon and the planets.
Right. Okay. And so there's
when the sun's over the southern hemisphere, it's more sunlight.
Right.
When the planets if Mars is over the southern hemisphere, we have more Mars light. The moon's over the southern hemisphere, we'll have more moonlight.
Right. Right. Okay. Thank you for that. And just a point of clarification, with regards to the times specified on the calendar, example, the rise and set times of the moon, do these vary with latitude and longitude, or is it necessary to calculate corrections to the calendar depending on where one is on the Earth?
Well, we talk about Tasmania and east coast of Australia, so we have the same longitude. Only difference can be from the calendar times is if your state has daylight saving or not. So Queensland doesn't make any difference. It's what the calendar times. But Tasmania adjusts to daylight saving times. And it's a big difference in latitude, huge difference in the time. So what I suggest, you can download sunrise and moonrise times from the web, but if you see that if you see that if the moonrise, I'll bring it later when we start to look at the constellations.
Okay.
So first the constellations. 5 of them are in the northern hemisphere, 5 of them in the southern hemisphere, and Pisces and Virgo over the equator. So if I see the moons over the equator, and I'm in Tasmania or anywhere on the East Coast, the time difference, not going to be much difference to Sydney time, which the latitude times are based on Sydney for the calendar.
Right.
So you won't have to make much adjustment. But if you see the moons over a northern hemisphere constellation, you'll find that, it'll rise later and set earlier in Tasmania than it will in Sydney.
Right.
So it's part of getting to know these constellations that then you start, it becomes more understandable. But if you want to be really precise, download something from the web from your latitude times.
Right. But overall, there shouldn't be too much difference between where we are in Tasmania and the times on the calendar currently.
There is a big difference when it's around peak descension or peak ascension for the moon.
Right.
Yeah, it's just like when you take it further south, for example, over Antarctica, there's a huge difference. Sometimes half the year is dark.
Yeah, right.
So that's, Tassie in about 40-degree latitudes, then you start to get quite a difference from Sydney in the 30-degree latitudes.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for that. Could we move on then to the main lunar cycles, particularly the I guess a general kind of overview of that, but then we might start with running through each of those key ones. Yes. And so a general one, and then we might start with the lunar phase or synodic cycle, 29.53 days cycle, also known as the to do with the light and the dark moon, new and full. And so we might, general overview, and then perhaps we start with that one.
Okay, well, for a general overview, I think we have to appreciate that it's not just the plants we're dealing with, it's a human being. And these rhythms affect the human being as much as they affect the plants. And we're going on a journey in biodynamics or trying to understand rhythms. We're also going on our own journey. Human beings involved every which way in these things. So first off, I'd like to suggest to download the How to Drive the Calendar. There's a lot of information already in there, and it's continually being upgraded or updated and developed. So that's the first step. And then the next step is to not to get too prescriptive on these rhythms, but more form a picture of it. If you can form an inner picture, it's much more alive and speaks a whole lot more than a bunch of facts like, okay, the 29.5 day rhythm or 8 days or whatever. But the phase rhythm, essentially you're coming towards full moon and then down to new moon. It's a rhythm of getting more and more light and then going more and more towards dark. And this light-dark rhythm of the moon, because the other rhythms are not light-dark rhythms, they're different rhythms. They are very much connected with levity and gravity. And for me, a way to understand these, because they very much affect growth and fertility forces, is to look at the human being cycle of levity and gravity, particularly in a female organism. That's essentially we're looking at growth and fertility, because it's a growth-fertility rhythm. So in the female organism, we have when a woman is fertile, she's able to hold life in her womb, if you like, and that defies gravity. It stays there and held contra to gravity. They come to menses or menstruation, and then that falls out and falls into law of just obeys gravity, not levity. That's that kind of rhythm, but in the human being is not synchronous with the plant rhythm and the plant and the moon phases, but the plant is. So when you're coming towards full moon, there's much more levitational forces abounding in the fluids of the earth, because the moon's very much related to fluid dynamics. So that you get the much higher tides You get much more sap, vigor in your plant. And you get bigger cell division in your plants. Yes, that sort of thing is happening. And growth and fertility are kind of synonymous. So if I want to measure growth, I can see in a plant that there's more life in matter. The grass grows a little bit more. You can see that. When you look to higher forms of growth in the animal kingdom, you have more growth when the cow or ewe gives birth to something else. And there's more growth in matter or life in matter.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just showing a relationship between growth and fertility.
Mm-hmm.
Now, growth fertility forces don't come in a straight line. It's not the same from day to day to day.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's a curve. It's a sine curve. So when you come towards full moon, you get much, much, much more levity, and then it wanes away. So day to day, those growth fertility forces follow a curve of climbing and then descending. But also to appreciate that if there's no moisture around, you can't harvest those growth fertility forces.
Right.
All right. So if things are dry, you'll catch a little bit because there's always some kind of moisture in the atmosphere. So really to make the best of it, to make sure that you're having a dry time, that you water, especially that last quarter building up to full moon, that you can harvest these forces, growth fertility forces.
Mm-hmm.
If you've had ample rain, you don't need to do that. But just to be aware, you don't harvest this without moisture.
Right. And so when you're saying light and levity, there's a correspondence between those. So the more light, the more levity. Could you talk a little bit about how they're related? Other than that, they are.
I think just to look at you have to look at phenomena to see it. So these things just observe to know. It's like you can't say it's because there's more nitrogen or more bags of phosphorus, or it's not a quantitative thing like that. It's a qualitative measure,
mm-hmm.
but it comes into matter as well, and then you see that.
Right. And so would it be fair to say that levity is impacted by the other lunar cycles? So if the moon is in the southern hemisphere,
yes.
It'll be a stronger force in the southern hemisphere when that's the case, and therefore that's affecting levity as well. Yes.
So you're bringing together two rhythms which have a relationship. So winter, those two rhythms come together and work together, and summer they're opposite. But also when it's more in the southern hemisphere, you get more hours of daylight.
Mm-hmm.
But you also might be having more hours of dark moonlight too, not necessarily full moon light.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you've got to.
Okay.
But it's good to start to weighing up the whole, not just the one rhythm in isolation.
Yeah. But both of those rhythms are impacting on the fluids within the atmosphere and therefore within the plant as well.
Yes. So when you get a whole lot of rhythms coming together,
yes,
then it can also be excessive. So also you tie in the season.
Yeah.
If it's summer and there's been lots of rainfall, you start to have excessive levitational forces,
mm-hmm.
and you draw up things like that belong in the ground. You draw right up into the plant, then you start to get fungal attacks and those sorts of things. Right.
So they'll accumulate. So they'll kind of have this accumulation effect.
Yes.
To kind of put things out of balance in terms of the what we're hoping the plant will do, and so we'd need to kind of counteract that with some biodynamic preparations, for example.
Yes, it could take prophylactic action.
Yeah.
In ahead of time, not when it's already happening. Okay.
So going back to the lunar phase or synodic cycle, you've got, it's to do with light. As it's increasing light, there's more levity in interacting with the system, and that will be associated with more life force happening, things rising through the plant and bigger, larger growth cycles and so forth. And the opposite, when it's dark, it's kind of it's there's less of it there. It's more. It might start to kind of fall under gravitational influences a bit
so
more.
You find in something like a wine grower, they probably choose to do their racking of their wines towards new moon.
Right.
So you take advantage of the more gravitational force, that you get more sediment at the bottom of your barrels.
Right.
When you rack off, you can leave a lot of that behind.
Right.
If you have a picture of it, you start to see, well, how I can apply it in my horticultural practices.
Fantastic. Okay. So, I mean, we touched on this one, but if you're able to move into the declination cycle, ascension, descension, moon high or low, and you've described previously as the dance between the hemispheres. If you could kind of unpack that a bit for us, that'd be great.
Yeah, so we've got a different rhythm now. It's not light and dark. It's how this movement between the hemispheres is. So when the sun's moving to the northern hemisphere, we get less radiant activity of the sun. And the same with the moon. As the sun moves into the northern hemisphere, come to winter. So try to have a picture then, if the moon's moving in the northern hemisphere, what's the winter type quality for the moon forces then? Mm-hmm. So they're working more through the earth rather than from above the earth. But it's only when at the equinox, it's not on the northern hemisphere or southern hemisphere. It's just sort of bang in the middle. But this is where observations become so important, that you just want to look and see where the moon's rising to get a feel for it, that you don't have to relate to a calendar to it. So all these things are easy to get to know just through observation. So if we start to get a habit of where it's rising, you've got a much clearer picture of where it is. But then where it's also rising the next day, what's the trend? Is it moving more north, or is it starting to move south? Is it descending or is it ascending? So really see it to what the altitude in the sky is and where it's rising and setting. Mm-hmm. So again, we look at it cumulatively with the phase rhythm. These two rhythms come into phase in wintertime. So at wintertime, you'll see the midwinter, you'll find the strongest full moons of the year. So your full moon is well over into the southern hemisphere, and you're having, say in Tasmania, you're having 18 hours of this moist, fertile moonlight in winter. So when the sun's weak, the moon's opposite the sun. Full moon means they're opposite the sun. The full moon is very, very strong. So you have a lot of trouble with kind of sleep and things like that. But there's kind of a balance. When the sun's weak, the full moon is really, really strong. And you've got this wonderful fecund, moist light coming in through over the winter time. But in summer, they're working in opposite poles. In summer, when the sun is strong, the full moon is very weak. So you've got this correspondence, and this interplay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned that at different times, then the forces might be working through the Earth rather than above the Earth if they're on the opposite side. Could you say a little bit more about that? What does that mean? How does that work?
I think it's perhaps a key thing to understand the biodynamic preparation making, which you're coming to the season now to make it. And for me, I always wait till the sun's in the northern hemisphere, and we have a more qualitative, instead of in summer we get a strong radiant light, but in winter we get a more subtle qualitative light of the sun force in a way working through the earth. And we've got a lot of our preparations buried in the earth at this time. So the sun has, in the summer we have this raw, radiant heat and light coming through, but in winter we get a much subtle, moist light, and you have more of the subtle forces of the light. So the sunlight also gives life in what's called ethers in biodynamics. A light ether comes through very, very strong, and the life ether. Now, life ether gives possibility that there can be life even in matter. So we want to imbue the Earth's substance with life, and that only happens through the subtle quality of the sun. We also have light that can bring consciousness for us in the human being, an inner light, and a soul light, as well as a kind of a spirit light, if you like. So it's kind of radiant in summer. It's a different thing altogether. It's much more forceful and much more subtle in the wintertime, but much, much more higher in quality. And where does life come from? How is it that there can be life in matter, which is very particular to the Earth and not necessarily other planets? There can be life right through the solar system, but life in matter is very peculiar and special to the Earth. And where's this coming from? It's coming out of the light of the sun, as well as talk about love and life and consciousness. These are also forces emanating from the sun. So, that's touching on something over there of difference between light through the Earth and light from above, especially in regards to the sun.
Right, thank you. Yeah, clearly an area that you could speak for a long time about, because it's some complexity to that. But thank you for that intro to it. Perhaps we could then...
I also say things from practical applications. I've already mentioned some of the racking you could do in wine, for example, catching the dark of the moon. But also people try to capture that full moon light force, its growth fertility force, and they try to usually plant 2 to 3 days before the full moon, or the quarter before the full moon, and you're really trying to capture that growth fertility, that you're trying to get your seed to sprout and germinate in that period before the full moon. It takes 2 to 3 days to sprout on a say your annual seed vegetable crops. So you try to capture that with that. And part of the ascending descending rhythm is it's important to make difference between transplanting and planting. So transplanting, you're disconnecting the plant from the earth and its connections there, and you're putting it in a new situation or taking out of a pot and planting it into the ground. That's very different to just planting a seed. So when you're transplanting, you're severing the plant's connection with the earth, and you try to make it reconnect. So the roots need to connect first. So you catch more of the descending rhythm, where the trend is more towards the earth or towards the northern hemisphere or towards below the ground connection there. And if you can catch the waning moon as well, and you're kind of reinforcing that activity. Planting a seed, it's something totally new. So when you plant the seed, it goes, germinates and sends its roots down, and that you try to catch more with the light growth fertility forces. So people often confuse transplanting. They want to transplant something. It's not planting, not like a seed planting. They're two different activities. You can work with different rhythms.
And so is that similar to what you were talking about before with that kind of that dance between gravity and levity? So the light forces, with the seed, for example, you're wanting that to kind of be more prominent, whereas the transplant...
So levity's got this growth fertility aspect of it.
Yeah.
And you're really bonding to the earth and to the sky when you're planting.
Right.
But if transplanting, you really got to help the plant to reconnect. It's already connected to the sky through the leaves.
Yes.
But you've severed its connection to the pot or to the earth.
Right.
And now you've really got to reconnect that.
Right. And so you
burst off before the plant can then take off.
And so you're preferencing the timing to kind of have that force concentrated at the root level.
Yes.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Just have a picture. Okay, I've severed my connection to earth with this plant. I'm going to reestablish that first for the plant to really thrive. If you plant at the wrong time, at the ascending time, they've got to wait 2 weeks to come back to that more earth rhythm connection time.
Mm-hmm. Right. Excellent. Okay, could we move on then to
Actually, well, I'll add one more thing there while we're on sort of practical activities.
Okay.
So when you're grafting, you think, well, what am I going to do there? So when I'm grafting, I've got this plant is connected still to the rootstock is connected to the earth. You haven't severed that connection.
Mm-hmm.
You've more severed the other connection. And then I'd look more towards ascending or a waning rhythm to catch my grafting.
Right. Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Just try to feel yourself in the plant.
Yeah.
What's going on? What I've done? What I need.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. Yeah. Anything else before we move on to the next one? Nothing else popping up for you?
Move on. Yeah.
All right, thank you. But the sidereal cycle, could you talk us a little bit about that, the so-called sojourn amongst the stars?
Okay. Well, first, there's a lot of confusion in the biodynamic planning calendars because of the different zodiacs. So the tropical zodiac and a sidereal zodiac.
Mm-hmm.
So the tropical, this calendar mainly works with the sidereal zodiac. And I qualify mainly later. So Sider just means stars.
Mm-hmm.
So when I look up in the sky and the calendar says the moon's in Scorpio, I can look up and see the moon and see the constellation Scorpio behind it. So my frame of reference is the star background.
Right.
That's how I'm measuring something. So that's the BD calendar, what that's got in there. The tropical zodiac would say a lot of astrologers use, the frame of reference is not the stars, even though they use the same naming, nomenclature. So for the frame of reference for the tropical zodiac is the seasons.
Right.
So the equinox and the solstices are the foundation for your seasons. So the four key constellations for the tropical zodiac are the equinox and solstices.
Mm-hmm.
So at the March equinox, that's when Aries begins. And then we have Tropic of Cancer and Capricorn, they're the solstices. That's when they begin.
Mm-hmm.
So the frame of reference is the horizon. Yeah, so we measure the equinoxes by the horizons. Yeah, we measure the solstices as by the horizons too, how far north or how far south something sets.
Right.
So there are two frames of reference. One uses the stars as a frame of reference. The other one uses the season as frame of reference. The Confucians have got the same names.
Right.
So I'm not saying either's right or wrong. We just got to understand what is the frame of reference. And a way the tropical zodiac is also in the calendar because it mentions the equinoxes and it mentions the solstices.
Right. Okay. And is there a particular, although you're saying there's kind of neither right nor wrong, each will have its advantages, is there a particular advantage of the sidereal candle cycle that you're looking at?
For me, it's more connected to to what I call the ethers, or to the force field in space, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
And without going into too much detail for that, I feel if you go into plant breeding or something, the tropical zodiac can be possibly of assistance there, where you're looking at something more of an archetypal nature for plant forces.
Mm-hmm.
But for the day-to-day and the weather and all that sort of thing, I think the sidereal zodiac is what we need to work with.
Right.
And also to empower ourselves to look up, that's where it is, and this is, I can connect more with my plant.
Right.
It empowers me more from my observation point of view. Like every farmer used to know these things, look up at the sky and know the constellations, know these different rhythms.
Right.
So we're trying to reconnect to that.
Right. So building that relationship, it's a context where the person is actually involved directly with observation. Yeah.
And now to build on that further, if we look at these if you look at the states of matter, for example, solid, liquid, gaseous, and plasmic, or warmth, these are 4 states of matter. In more of a Greek or Aristotelian way of looking at it, they'd call it earth, water, air, and fire. They're just states of matter. So earth is anything solid, which includes ice. It's in a solid state. There's different laws of physics applied to something when it's solid, liquid, gaseous, or plasmic. So, yeah, if we look at liquid, it has its own laws. So, it's a lot to do with chemical laws too, chemistry, laws of chemistry. And the gaseous are very much connected to air, what the Greeks would call air, and fire, warmth. Now, if you look at the constellations, there are 3 earth, 3 water, 3 air, 3 fire. And that wherever there's an earth constellation, I've colored in a brownish color, you'll find association with roots. So roots is where the most mineral component of the plant is, the most solid, the most form-structured part of the plant is. Wherever it's a water constellation, you'll see a leaf below. Where it's more airy, you'll see a flower. And where it's more fiery, you'll see a red fruit there. And the fiery, to see fruit or seeds, anything with got flavor in or aroma has hydrogen in it. And hydrogen is this fire gas, if you like.
Right.
Anything that's got hydrogen can combust. So hence the fruits and seeds are connected with the fire, not just seeds. Now, it builds to a further question that you had over there, these trigons, or these, what other aspects are there in there. So you'll see every now and then there's a triangle next to one of these symbols of a fruit or leaf or whatever.
Yeah.
And the fly come very much out of Maria Thune's work. And for example, all the fire signs are 120 degrees apart. All the air signs are 120 degrees apart.
Right.
Now, if in the sky, if we see 2 planets 120 degrees apart, they're going to be reinforcing or having effect on the same element. So if one's in fire, the other one's also in fire. So from Maria Thune's observations and work, if she saw that the moon was in a fire sign, the planets were in a trine relationship in a different sign, she would say that what the planets were in will override what the moon is in.
Right.
So the moon rhythms are kind of underpinning going through the zodiac. The moon kind of opens the doors to these zodiacal forces. That's it, channels through wherever the moon is in.
Right.
But if the planets are also doing the same activity, they can override what the moon is, especially when they're 120 degrees apart, because they're in the same element. So when there's a contraindication from moon to planets, I have the trine there still, but I have a little black dot there next to it.
Right.
But if they're supportive, I have an asterisk next to that. Now, in the way I work with calendar, which is quite different to other BD calendars, is I don't put any thou shalt not plant type things in it. I inform people. That's my task. There's so many different ways to work with these different rhythms. And I see my task as informing people, not telling people, because I don't pretend to know everything. And I think we're still in the kindergarten in this area, and we have a lot to learn. And it's this collaborative learning that'll take us on. So if I become a very prescriptive calendar and become an authority, and it becomes a recipe book, then we all lose. Yeah. Right. It's not a way to research or to go ahead. Right. And I could have made a mistake, or we still got a lot to learn. So if we have that attitude and a collaborative working, we'll go ahead.
Right.
It becomes a science rather than a dogma.
Yeah, so it's not always this or always that. There's times where it's advantageous and other times not, and to prescribe that, like you said, in other calendars where there might be whole sections kind of blacked out as don't do anything here during this time.
Yes.
That's not always the case. There are times where it could be actually quite useful to be doing some particular activities. Yeah. Okay. While we're on that, so we've started kind of moving down that direction of trining. If what's the idea of planets in opposition mean?
Okay.
How does that work? And if we had an example, for example, if the moon is opposite to Saturn, one presumes there's a straight line between them and the Earth. Is that how that works? And what are the implications?
I'll develop that.
Right. Okay.
Let's add one more thing from the previous bit.
Yep.
When you're turning a compost heap, for example, you might decide when to actually turn something. But if you see a compost heap is very rank and sodden, then it's going to need more air and warmth in. So you might pick constellation to turn it where you're going to enhance that, rather than with kind of a earth or water constellation where you're exacerbating a thing.
Okay.
So if we start to think into my compost or into my plant or how I'm planting, then we can be more discerning and find a creative solution to something.
Okay.
Sometimes I might need air and warmth. Sometimes actually we need to enhance the moisture density component, and we might work with an earth or water sign.
Right.
So now to go into oppositions factors. Okay. So, for example, Saturn-Moon opposition is very popular with some BD groups, and very much was Peter Proctor was a great enthusiast of this one. I feel it's for me it's dangerous to be have a very, for me, simplistic approach. So first off, what are the if you go through the agriculture course and astronomy courses and understanding human being and medicine and so on, Stein makes quite a distinction between inner planets and outer planets. And I can show that through history of astronomy, but it's not, it doesn't work for this show.
Right.
So I have to take my word for it. They are very quite distinct differences to them. So the inner planets, what he'd call Moon, Mercury, and Venus, are very much to do with the lime pole in agriculture for alkalinity, for limestone, potassium, sodium, those sorts of things, for substance formation. Whereas the Mars, Jupiter, Saturn pole is more to do with quality, aroma, flavor, non-substantial, but very, very fine in their forces. So if you work with moon opposition, you're picking the epitome, the classic inner planet, which is the moon, and you're picking Saturn as the classic outer planet. So in a way, an opposition can bring together what you need for substance formation in your plant and what you need for quality and aromas and flavors and so on in the plant.
Right.
So that's all very nice. But sometimes you can have an eclipse when that Saturn-Moon opposition takes place. You might have the moon be a new moon rather than full moon.
Right.
There's all these variables, and it can also be very contra time. It could be a terrible time to do something like that. So, but on the other hand, sometimes when people have a lot of enthusiasm for something and work with a particular rhythm, something can come in and support it. If you like, elemental beings or whatever you want to call them, people work in all sorts of many different ways. But for me, I like to see the whole and work with the whole, and I try to work quite consciously and deliberately, which I think is kind of a path of the modern human being. To really understand and feel and experience some of these things, rather than just stuck, this is a recipe, I'll just do this every month.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
But for that Saturn-Moon opposition or any opposition, they are directly opposite in the sky and the Earth's in the middle. You're the observer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. But like you said, that could be that the moon might be at a different phase. There might be different things impacting. So it's never it's never completely one way. It's everything's in flux. Everything's kind of in movement. Everything's going through. These cycles are not always showing up in the same place at the same time directly. There'll be influence variations. Yeah. Right. Okay.
It's tempting to give it to beginners. Oh, just do this rhythm.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then set an opposition.
Yeah.
You're right.
Yeah.
Excuse me. But yeah, it's a trap too.
Right. Okay. Anything else on the sidereal cycle before we move on?
I'll have a look at. Oh yes. Excuse me. On the calendar, there's a map at the top of the page.
Mm-hmm.
So the moon phases are going through, and there's a map of the world behind. So when things happen for me, say in Virgo,
mm-hmm.
which you always find Virgos over the east coast of Australia in my mapping. This is kind of out of my research work.
Right.
Excuse me. I'll take perhaps more note of it. It's also when the planets over that area. I can refer the planets back and look at the moon chart map there, and it'll be the same. So I used to have one for the planets as well.
Right.
Years ago, I was doing more weather input into the map, into my work. But for me, the east coast of Australia is more affected when something's in Virgo.
Okay.
There's lots more to it than that, but this is a foundation part. And also, you'll find it's also where this warmth pool moves between South America and goes up into the Indonesian area, which is also in this Virgo area. So like we have this La Nina effect. It's not just La Nina effect at the moment. In the last 6 weeks, there's also these planetaries bunching together.
Right.
Water. That created all this rainfall on the east coast, not the west coast. So things, planetary and lunar events are happening all the time, all over the world, but they have a pronounced effect in one location. It might take a few days to get to your location to see that effect or that some phenomena coming out of it. It's starting to get a bit more advanced there, so I'll just touch on it now.
Right.
Here's a map up there if you want to ever check something. But you always notice that Australia, the moon's position of Australia, when that occurs, what date of the month.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. And just just to kind of reiterate some of what you were saying earlier on this, that if the moon is in front of that particular constellation, it's
yes.
I think the metaphor you used was it kind of opens the door to those to the influences that come from that particular constellation, and that may be an earth, fire, water, or air-based influence, and therefore that would align then with particular parts of the plant, for example, or what you might be wanting to do with, say, compost is another example you used. So there'll be a particular understanding that can be brought to a particular activity based on what constellation is sitting behind the moon at any particular time.
Yes, I also like to add there's still a lot more research to be done in that area.
Mm-hmm.
And also like to say the sun does it in a different way. The sun in front of a constellation opens a particular doorway and a different way to the moon. So the moon's more around moisture and growth and fertility, and the sun is far more powerful of things like life and consciousness and things like that, and effects on the soul and the spirit and whatever else. Yeah.
Okay. Excellent. That's great. And again, there's so much more to follow up on that, and we'll hopefully get to you later another time to deepen that conversation. If we could move on to the perigee-apogee cycle, lunar cycle, that's to do with whether the moon is near or far. You've referred to it as a relationship balancing process. Could you explain and elaborate that a bit more for us?
Yeah, first always form a picture. So I'll put those little summaries first. So it's just like in human relationships. You make a friend and you like to be a bit close, but then you need your distance. Mm-hmm. You can't have just be close all the time and you can't be distant all the time. There's this movement back and forth.
Yeah.
It's very much like the ellipse. Sometimes it comes close and sometimes going far, which is this perigee-apogee movement. Mm-hmm. It's elliptical movement. At times the moon's very close, sometimes very far. Now, if you look through the times that the moon spends in the constellation through any month, you'll see around perigee, where it says perigee in the map, mm-hmm. the moon moves very quickly through constellations. So I'm using a sidereal zodiac of equal signs. Everyone's 30 degrees.
Right.
So sometimes you'll find, even though they're all 30 degrees apart, around perigee, it'll only take 2 days to go through a constellation.
Right.
But when it's towards apogee, sometimes it can take nearly 4 days to go through one constellation.
Yeah, right.
All the constellations are equal size, but the rate of movement through them is different.
Because of where the moon is in relation to the Earth in terms of perigee
so when
getting
it's close,
closer. Yeah.
Getting close. It's like this moon and Earth having a dance.
Right.
I want to get close. Nothing's clockwork.
Right.
Everything's live. Everything's animated. Everything has a soul in a way. So if you relate as a human being to any of these rhythms, you can start to understand them. Mm. If the human being truly is a microcosm of the macrocosm, well, as above, so below. Mm. And for me, it really is, after having been living for years with these things, we can understand anything by just saying, oh, how does that in me, or how can I experience that? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And can I see it in my relationship with other people? Mm-hmm. Yeah. These in a way, beings out there in space are far more than lumps of rock cruising around or lumps of gas or anything else.
Right.
And everything happening out there is affecting down here. Mm-hmm. But looking into myself, I can really start to understand what's going on out there. Looking at what's going on out there, I can understand in myself.
Right.
Yeah. So everything, if I ever have a problem, I try to come back to human being, try to understand, well, how do I? Okay, then I should find some sort of correspondence there and understand it in a much more, concept way, a picture. Right. I can get a picture out of it.
Right.
A picture can speak so much and empower us a lot.
And so what's arising for me as you're saying that is you're saying when the perigee, when the moon is closer to the Earth, there's is it like a dance, and that kind of impacts the speed with which it moves through particular background constellations, and that it's a bit like
and intensity.
And intensity.
So when you're close to your friend, and the relationship is far more intense.
Yes.
So what does the moon bring? Bringing growth and fertility. Mm-hmm. and fecundness and moisture. Right. But that can be way too intense.
Right.
If you're already moist conditions on the Earth and it's already warm. So you got warm and moist, and you've got this intensity coming in, then you're going to have problems big time.
Right. Yeah. So it can work either way. There's like you said, there's this kind of rhythm of contact and withdrawal, moving towards, moving away. Intensity is an impact, and sometimes that level of contact can be wonderful and fun, and time goes too quickly when you're having fun, and then at other times it could be irritating, or it's too much, and it has another it has a different kind of feel to it. So
and conventionally the biodynamic calendars they put, like in the Kimmerton Hills or Maria Chun calendars, this is a no planting time.
Right.
But for me, especially in a lot of Australian conditions, hang on, if we're going for a long period of, dry and so on, and we need this moisture, we need this intensity of that activity.
Mm-hmm.
But also everything's exacerbated when you've got this perigee. So initially I used to think, well, maybe it was just sort of floods and things like that. Flooding time when you had summer rains and you had this perigee coming up.
Mm-hmm. But
then I started to realize I really need to look at where my high and low pressure cells are at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So when I got a very perigee coming on, I can look at South Australia in summer, for example, and I might find a high pressure over there. And if it's a high pressure, you've got no cloud activity, no moisture, and then you get more chance of having bushfire.
Right.
You've got extreme heat.
Yes.
Whereas it might be northeast Queensland, you've got low over there, and they've had already rain, that could be flooding. I could look at Western Australia at my synoptic chart, and I might see the isobars are very close together.
Mm-hmm.
I get strong wind.
Right.
So everything's intensified. It doesn't necessarily just mean floods. You really got to refer back to your weather map, look at those high pressure cells or what's building, and
Mm-hmm.
anticipate to see what's coming. So there's not one thing suits all.
Right.
You've got to really look at the other factors, and those weather synoptic charts are very helpful.
Okay. But would it be, I'm presuming that they'd be influenced by the other rhythms and vice versa? Is that what you're saying?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I'll come to that. But first, just get a picture.
Right.
And it's not going to be the same thing all over. I refer back to my weather chart to understand what this likely consequence of this perigee is going to be.
Right. Okay.
And then, whether I need to take prophylactic action or say, okay, this is a good time to plant,
right,
or whatever.
Right.
But now these perigee rhythms, perigee-apogee rhythms, they have peaks every year. So some perigees are one heck of a lot closer than other perigees.
Right.
But when this perigee-apogee rhythm comes into sync with the phase rhythm, then you've got an exponential change in the tidal forces in your plant or in the sea or in the river or whatever. It's amazing. Right. So, the moon can vary from 356,000 kilometers away to over 408,000 kilometers away. That's a big, big difference.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see it in the sky, a perigee moon, or especially the super ones.
Right.
You can see the moon looks bigger.
Yeah.
And there's a marked difference that you can see in tides. And your plant is tidal too.
Right.
The Sapturga. Yeah. So when you've got a perigee coming, it's going to be strong anyway. But when you've got these, and there's perigees every month, so it's not necessarily a big deal. But if you've got these big perigees where it starts to come close to the full moon or new moon, then you get very, very powerful perigees.
Right.
So those are ones to really take particular note of.
Right.
So I usually say this is the biggest, second biggest, or third biggest every year.
Right.
But anything kind of under 357,000 kilometers of the moon range, and all those distances are given in the calendar, that's when you really got to watch out.
Right.
And really look at your charts and look what's prevailing weather conditions and so on.
Right. So there's a number of things going on there, and potentially some quite intense weather conditions might be associated with that.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier, or probably in the reading, we're not just talking about water and say in the tides or within the plant itself. We're talking about that in the overall atmosphere and even down into the earth in terms of the molten the lava and so forth under the surface of the earth. So that all of that's impacted by, say, perigee and moon phase and all of those other cycles as well. So everything's kind of being shaped and moved around as a result of those cosmic rhythms.
Yeah, so the moon force has anything to do with the liquid sphere, liquid. Right. So yeah, molten includes liquids.
Yes, yeah.
Comes at different laws to solids.
Right. And so in those kind of, as just building on what you're saying, in terms of those, when it's a very intense kind of perigee, you might have some other factors like, a supermoon kind of period and so forth. Is that likely to kind of impact on, volcanoes erupting or earthquakes, events, that kind of thing?
Very much.
Right.
Yeah. So one of those devastating Christchurch earthquakes was very much a supermoon, whereas the other one wasn't. It was more of a planetary activity.
Right.
But it's extreme, whether it's wind or heat or rain.
Right. Yeah. Right. Okay. And so apogee is kind of like the opposite of what you're saying. It's kind of like there's less intense.
Yeah, it's much more distance.
Right.
And for example, some people like to plant potatoes around them. You get more of a terrestrial force, not so much influenced by the lunar force. Or it might be a better time when you've got to plant when you've got a lot of rain and heat, warmth anyway, which you're going to get a lot of fungal attack. You're probably better to back off and plant more around apogee time and look for that to have more of a balancing factor.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So many things to consider. Which is like, I guess, why you're saying there's never a straightforward one-size-fits-all kind of response.
No, but just trying to have a picture. Here's my balance.
Yeah.
So if I look at the calendar, I see if all those lunar activities are happening close together, it's already one-sided.
Right.
So for the last 6 weeks, we've had a very one-sided effect, but all the planets were together.
Right. Right.
Yeah, and going through Capricorn in that sort of February-March period, we had Sun, Pluto, Saturn, Venus, Mars all together, and the moon flashing by.
Yeah, right.
And this was this what brought on all this flooding.
Floods, yeah.
So it's not so much climate change through the human being effect in this Anthropocene era. These rhythms are ongoing.
Right.
They didn't change.
No. The
human beings had an effect for sure, but this radical change, you can't say, well, that's climate change.
Yeah.
There were rhythms that were taking place anyway, and that was going to happen irrespective.
Right. In spite even though there may have been some there's likely be some influence of the human activity as well over longer periods.
Yeah, some things don't change.
Yeah.
Some things do change.
Yeah.
But this for me, I get a bit annoyed when climate change is used so readily. We don't become discerning what has changed and what hasn't changed.
Right. And again, I guess as something you pointed out before, that's a kind of reductionistic kind of view, just to kind of put it down to this one thing, it's climate change, as opposed to the complexity of everything else that's kind of going on. And, so it makes more sense to kind of find ways of working with the complexity rather than just keep defaulting to reductionistic kind of responses or explanations.
Yes. Yeah. People are fond of the KISS principle, keep it simple, stupid acronym.
Yeah.
Or, Occam's razor was what they call it in a scientific terminology. But
yes,
human beings' mind is amazingly complex in many different ways. And so is everything.
Yeah. Absolutely. Okay. Let's keep moving if we can. Could we talk a little bit about the nodal cycles and how that works? You've described that as a three-way meeting. It involves more than two things. You've got at least three things going on there. And I really love your metaphor of, being in a building at the same level, at the same floor, at the same time, and something's going to happen. Yeah.
Well, it's a moment of angst. If you look at meetings, we can meet by mobile phone. If you're trying to meet human to human, it's no good if somebody's on the first floor, somebody's in the basement, somebody's on the ground floor. To have a proper meeting, you all need to be on the same floor. And basically that's what happens at any nodal crossing, is the moon, the earth, and the sun on the same floor.
Right.
So if we have a human analogy, when we have a meeting, the first part's pretty intense because you have 6 monthly meetings or 5-year rhythms or whatever. But if you're having 6 monthly meeting, your old planners start to fade away. You need to come together to put a plan for the next 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of an analogy I draw. It's kind of intense at first, until you work it out. Then you've got a impulse to go for the next 6 months or whatever the rate of your meetings are.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how I see it. So it's kind of an uncertain time without a clear impulse of the previous pattern, if you like, the next 6 month pattern or next 2 week pattern, whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
I see it more as a challenge rather than as a thou shalt not sort of thing.
Right.
If you can bring a clear picture yourself, perhaps you can override it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying you can, but I think this is the attitude we need to have. How can I work with it? Be conscious of what's happening, and then, meet the challenge or say, okay, I can wait a few hours or whatever. Now, a lunar node will only take a couple of hours, in a sense, to pass through.
Mm-hmm.
So some people don't plan to allow about a 2-hour break.
2-hour break, yeah.
But then, a farmer can't, if there's a Jupiter node, for example, that can take months to move through. It can be sitting on the ecliptic within a very small margin. You can't say, I can't plant for the next 6 months or 2 months or whatever the case may be.
Right.
Moon's okay, 2 hours, that's okay, no big deal. But when you start to get the slow moving planets, these can take weeks, even months, to be on that node, that challenge.
So just so we're clear, Brian, is that when you're saying, say, one of those slower moving planets, is that the movement of that particular planet when it's crossing the sun's path and at the Earth at the same time? Yeah. Right. And so that's a slower move.
You've got Jupiter, Earth, and
right. So
the sun on the same plane.
Yeah. So they're the three participants in this meeting, and it's a longer meeting. Right.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. And the as you're saying that, you kind of the thing that just kind of flashed up for me was like doing a 500 stir. You've kind of got this ordering kind of process going on. Then there's the chaos of the meeting, and then then you've got the order coming back in again for another period, and it's it can be certain lots of uncertainty around that chaotic period, but then that's where the creativity and growth and newness kind of arises from.
The new impulses can come in.
Yeah.
So you're talking about the stirring. Well, that's when we really I put great importance on these synoptic charts because that's what we're doing. Yeah. So clockwise vortex, high pressure cell.
Yeah.
What is it apart from going clockwise?
Mm-hmm.
So what is the phenomenon? What do you experience as a human being when there's a high pressure cell? So in the morning, all this cold, fresh, new, invigorating is coming down.
Mm-hmm.
No clouds form. You feel alive. You feel invigorated.
Mm-hmm.
A low pressure is going. Sorry, that was what did I say? Did I say?
You said high.
High pressure is anti-clockwise.
Right.
The low pressure is clockwise in the southern hemisphere, and that's gathering all the stale air and exhausting that out.
Right.
Kind of in-breathing and an out-breathing, in-breathing and an out-breathing. This is what we're doing with the stirring. We're not just, I'm stirring clockwise, I'm stirring clockwise. And people ask, well, why? But I say, well, have a look at vortices. What's actually going on?
Yeah.
But when you're in a high pressure cell, you're invigorated. When you're low pressure cell, it's kind of much more laggard, more dull, if you like.
Right. Yeah.
So look, if we live into these things more and experience them, we'll start to understand more what we're doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But each time you create something anew, which you're doing with the stirring, you imprint more and more, and you make it more and more alive, more and more Anyway, I won't go into that because there's a lot more I could say on vortices.
Absolutely, yeah. Just going back to the nodal cycle then, eclipses can only occur at those nodal points, and, eclipses are something that we need to be aware of.
Yes. Okay. So without modeling it, the eclipse seasons happen every 6 months. Okay. So when we have an ordinary node, the sun's not necessarily in the right, the moon's crossing the sun's path, but the sun's not exactly opposite at that time, or conjunct with it. But when we've got actually eclipse, all these come together very well, and then you have an eclipse season. Only occur every 6 months. But when the eclipse season comes on, we'll have fortnightly apart, you'll have a lunar eclipse and a solar eclipse. Sometimes even 3. Right. Lunar, solar, lunar. But yeah, so every 6 months we have these eclipses. So I think those, if you like, meetings are much more intense and I'd say more problematic. And in that whole season too, which can take about a month of passing through that eclipse season, every 6 months, but then there's lunar, solar, lunar, solar. Lunar, solar, lunar, 3 of them. That can be over a period of a month or a bit longer. Observing weather, sometimes you have very strange weather you don't quite expect. So it's kind of a angst time in a way.
Right. Okay. And so it's similar to it's the same as what you were just talking about with nodes generally. It's just that these are perhaps more intense. Is that what you're saying?
And it lasts quite a longer period.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
The imprint that happens in the atmosphere hangs around.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So they're the main kind of lunar cycles that you've tracked through for us. Just in terms of there's 2 questions here. One is to try to, if you can kind of expand this into what you have on your calendar as Brian's suggestions for the lunar rhythms, and that goes into things like, composting, pruning, etc. But of those cycles that you've just gone through with us, the phase cycle, the light dark, the high low moon, the near far, 3-way meeting, etc. And the background of constellations, are there particular ones that you might consider more foundational in terms of making decisions about farming, gardening activities, and others that are more kind of like fine-tuning? And I know you've kind of been mentioning this a little bit as we've been going through already, but if you could just kind of elaborate, maybe clarify that for us, that would be fantastic.
Okay.
Because it doesn't look like your suggestions are based on one rhythm at all, right? So
no, they aren't.
My impression is that you're considering all of those things at once.
Yeah, I feel foundational is the lunar phase rhythm, in conjunction that the beginner really starts observing where things rising and setting are. Okay. So start to working with ascending, descending, but empowering themselves by learning. By observing and taking records for that matter. So I put in conjunction with the season. You can't ignore the sun.
Right.
Yeah. So what's the season doing? Is the moon, say, such an element, and the sun's supporting it, the planet's supporting it? But that's the foundation is the phases in the season, and really observing.
Okay.
Start to know where you stand on your property or on your veranda or whatever. There's east. There's where it's most north of east. That's a solstice point. That's where it's most south of east. That's another solstice point. There's a ranging in between there. Really get a hang of that and just know it intuitively. Just, it's over there. This is happening.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
The sun determines a lot of this. It's just a matter of, that's where the sun is at that time. So how can I picture that in relation to the sun? this winter sun, look where it's risen, right down there. Oh, the moon's rising there at the moment. Yeah, start to have more aha moments.
Right.
But observing, which is a skill we've lost.
Right. And so, if I'm hearing you correctly, Brian, and again referring back to some of what you've already said today, it doesn't make a lot of sense just to kind of stick with one cycle, say for example the phase cycle or the ascension descension, and kind of go, right, well it's ascension and therefore there's more levity happening and therefore I should be doing X, Y, and Z, because there's so many other things that can be influencing that. Yeah. Like you're saying, time of year, where is the sun? Are we in a midsummer or midwinter? Is going to be different impact of each of those. The influence of the light of the moon is going to be quite different in winter compared to summer, as you've already mentioned.
The full moon, not every moon phase, right. But full moon. Yep.
Full moon, yeah. And also in the apsidal cycle, how close or far is the moon from where the Earth is? So all of those things, the complexity of all of that. So somebody just starting out with this and perhaps even just listening to that's probably going, man, this is too much. I don't know how to handle it.
That is too much.
Yeah.
That's what I'm just saying. Just start with the phase rhythm.
Right.
And out of what you know about the sun rhythm, because everybody's observed the sun and knows, at least intuitively, not so necessarily so consciously, and then connected. Okay, when the sun does that, it means that.
Yeah.
What's this thing?
Right.
That's knowledge of the sun rhythm. Stick with the phases as something simple, and they know.
Mm-hmm.
But then relate it to these two things.
Right.
Through observing.
Right. Okay. And so will your
make your stone henge or wood henge or plant hedge.
Right.
There's where the winter sun is.
Uh-huh.
There's where the summer sun is.
Right.
There's where the equinox is.
Okay. So
that can be fun too.
Yeah.
Plant something. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, excuse me.
Yeah. Okay. So
stick on the window.
Yeah, and so get some method of kind of monitoring what's happening in the celestial bodies through direct observation, and something that may be fixed on the Earth that be able to kind of indicate where that is for you. But you're actually looking at doing that for your own property.
Yes.
But you're consulting these other rhythms, but at the same time, it's you're not wanting to mistake the map for the territory, as they say. You've got to be looking up and out as well as kind of conscious of what's happening weather-wise and soil moisture and a whole bunch of other things.
Yeah.
But to get started, give preference to direct observation and maybe the phases of the moon and understanding where the sun is and what's the influence of the sun.
Yeah, only when you're later ready, you go into the next bit.
Right. Okay. So you can add that.
Build a foundation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Foundation is the sun's rhythms.
Right. And so your suggestions in the calendar then is that how do you come to that? Is that what you're just saying? You just keep adding the layers. There's an overlay of the next one and the next one, and then you're adjusting.
Well, so those sort of my suggestions there. It's not something I wanted to do. I really feel we've got to think for ourselves and not sit on recipes.
Mm-hmm.
And so initially I put in after a lot of hassling, people asking me, and I left it a couple of years and I withdrew it, and there was a lot of complaints again. So but I don't. I don't really want to do it. I'd rather not have it there. Right. I want people to think and not just follow along. And then I think the worst for it.
Right.
So I can relate to some people. I just need that as really, really beginners who are a bit lost.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
So basically what I've done is I've taken essence of all the expansions and contractions and summarized them and avoided things like eclipses or funny things like that.
Right. Okay.
There's indications or suggestions I've given.
Yep.
That's all I've done.
Okay.
Yeah. So I've looked at, say, waxing, waning. Waxing is more of an expansive rhythm. Waning is a contracting rhythm.
Right.
Ascending is more of an expansion. Descending is a contraction.
Yeah.
Perigee is a contraction. Apogee is expansion.
Right.
I've taken the essence of all. Then earth sign and a water sign is more of a contraction, and air and water is expansion.
Right.
I've tried to find essence of all those. Right. And remove some of the more challenging bits.
Okay. Yeah. And your challenge then is for people to look at that and kind of go, right, well, there's your starting point, but now you go out and observe, adjust, and use your own resources, empowering people to kind of do that for themselves and not just.
And that doesn't have to be a starting point either.
Right. Right.
It could be just the waxing, waning.
Right.
Just the one rhythm that they see and comprehend and work with.
Yeah. Okay. Right. All right. Excellent. Just conscious of time, could you talk? I know you've kind of touched on this already, but could you kind of elaborate a little bit more on the root, leaf, fruit, flower days? I mean, you talked on it in relation to the zodiacal rhythms before, but if there was anything else you could kind of add to that, that would be really useful.
Without going into ethers, I don't know, I could go into ethers. Because what you're trying to work with in biodynamics is trying to understand these ethers in correlation to the elements. So if we start with warmth, for example, warmth can be an inner experience, and it could come out of nowhere like blushing, right, or suddenly get very angry. This warmth appears and becomes more external. When it's that inner warmth, that's more of an ether. When it's more radiant warmth, that's more fire, if you like. So warmth and fire, I'm differentiating. Right. But warmth is the ether and fire is the element. If we look at something like air, something airy form, we start looking at the laws of light and gases. So air, without air, atmosphere, we don't have light. Light in subtlety is emanations of ethers. Gas is we need air to experience light or to have light working through it. But there's much more subtle forces working with light, and which is the ether, which would have life, subtle forms of light, like we can have inner light, consciousness, even love. These all subtleties working in the light. Then we can have liquid, and any chemical reaction, you always need a salt. And there's hundreds of salts, like in the ocean, and liquid in some form to have a chemical reaction. But in liquid, we have, in chemistry, any reaction that takes place happens in whole number relationships. So we have H2O. It's not H2.5, O, 1.67, whatever. All chemical reactions take place in whole number relationships. That lawfulness is the chemical ether, also known as the number ether. It's also what you find in music. You get particular harmonics with whole number relationships. That's the ether associated with liquids. This is what we're working for. Right. And where we have solid. Now, without a solid body, we couldn't become self-conscious and be able to carry consciousness in us. And there's different levels of consciousness, but yeah. So these are 4 elements and 4 ethers. And just say a bit more on the water ether. So when we're making the biodynamic preparations, we're working with plant materials and usually flower parts. And the plant has a wisdom with the chemical ether. So it knows the right proportion to have with potassium, with sulfur, with sodium or calcium or whatever else. We're using herbs. We're not getting bags of this, that, and the other.
Yes.
Well, okay, we'll get a few grams of. The herbs know how to hold these together in a wide proportional way that support each other.
Mm-hmm.
This is the chemical ether working.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so when we're working through these elements, through the star sign, we're drawing and trying to work with particular ether forces and focus them. It's not generally understood in biodynamics, unfortunately, but this, I feel we need to understand ethers and see how they work and really understand our preparations in a much deeper way.
Right.
But herbs are wise. They have an intelligence, a wisdom to work in proportions through the chemical ether, to combine elements together in a way that support each other and are most medicinal, most enhancing.
Right. Right. Yeah, the big difference between, say, calcium from an oak bark than something that may come from a mineral source. Yeah.
Well, oak bark is the highest form of living calcium, even though it's indigenous to acidic soils.
Mm.
This, nature works in the opposite, but that's going in another realm.
Right.
But
Yeah. And so
immense depths in these areas.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so bringing this back to the root, leaf, fruit, flower days.
Yes.
Is that what you were talking? So as we were talking before, if the moon is in front of a particular, say, a fire sign, what does that mean in terms of so that's a flower day? Is that what we're understanding? It's simply to do with
it's a fire day will be plant and seed. So if you're wanting to enhance, say, a particular herb or its qualities of aroma and flavor, you try to work with those, anything that supports the fire ethers and the fire element. Right. Okay. So if I'm growing something like a root crop, it's more the mineral nature of the roots and the substance nature and the form nature of the root, then I look more at an earth constellation. Right. What am I trying to work with? What am I trying to enhance in my plant? The plant has these all 4 parts, but they all have different nutritional needs, medicinal needs, are things where we focus one part of a plant. Yeah. We want to focus the aroma area. Do I want to focus the fine flower gestures and leaves for the florist? Do I want to, something much more stimulating for the head and work with a root crop? Yeah. If you develop the salts very well and the form of it. Yeah. Yeah. What do I want to enhance in a plant? Right. Right. And so it's basically just taking that understanding of where the moon is in relation to the constellation, what's of the elements is that actually involving, and through our intention, our behaviour, are actually intensifying or enhancing that process. And like you said, if it's for whatever, if we're wanting to enhance a root function or a seed function or a flavour or a quality, then those sorts of things will be influenced by where the moon is against that. And also where the planets are and the sun. Right. Yeah. So, right. Okay. So last question. We've got, if we can get this in the next 6 minutes. Okay. So you talked before about let's not look at this as a let's not just defer to the calendar as a Bible or an instruction booklet, but to kind of really develop our own capacity to feel, observe, and kind of get an intuition for what's actually happening.
through experience. What have you got any tips on how people might be able to kind of develop that aspect, that personal quality? Yeah.
I'll put a first kind of axiom, if you like, written here. The nature of one's thinking, feeling, and how it governs one's action will determine the health of one's environment and beyond.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're just thinking materialistically, we're not forming pictures, well, that's going to affect your environment.
Mm-hmm.
To put even to another level, I could be walking through a national park. If I'm just thinking materialistic thoughts, negative thoughts, that's going to harm the environment in itself.
Right.
What we can do, what we think and we feel is very, very important in our garden.
Mm-hmm.
So keep observing clouds, planets, stars, where they rise and set.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And when something unusual or extreme happens in the weather, take a note of it and check the calendar to see if you can find any correlations.
Okay.
And be aware that watching your highs and lows, if you're looking for correlations, it might be something affecting West Australia, and it's going to take 2 or 3 days to get to Tasmania.
Mm-hmm.
But just observations, basically.
Right.
And really realize you're on a journey. It's not just about planting something.
Right. Yeah. So on the one hand, you appear to be advocating adopting a kind of scientist perspective. Just observe, note, record, go back, reflect in terms of correspondences with other reference points that you may have. But then that last thing you just said is kind of implying that it's not just about what's happening around us. It's about kind of internal observation too. It's about kind of tuning into what's happening within us as human beings.
And in that tuning in and getting to know, you start to love.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you start to love the planets in the sky,
mm-hmm.
and you start to heal yourself, reconnecting to what's going on up there. It's a healing process
mm-hmm.
in itself, and it's joyful.
Right.
This is a bit hard work, but you've got to, we sort of modern human beings start by thinking. They really got to open up our feeling.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of it's scientific, but it's also working with love.
Right. And you've mentioned a few times.
The scientific can be very hard and cold and killing.
Yeah.
If you're working just purely conceptually, abstractly, with formulas and measurements and so on,
yeah,
it kills life.
Right. But you've mentioned a few times, try to get a picture of something. There's a kind of image emergence of an image as opposed to purely kind of looking at so-called objective phenomena outside of the self. Yeah. So there's something that's kind of emerging within in correspondence to that. Yeah. In almost like a meditative state of kind of letting go of that kind of contracting thought process and kind of allowing something else to come in.
Yeah, if you start with imaging, other things start to build, and then you start to get insights and so on. Right. That's a whole nother level, but it starts off with pictures, forming pictures.
Right.
Pictures. The picture's always out of life.
Mm-hmm.
You're not having pictures of a computer at the heart of a pump or anything like that. That's destructive, highly destructive.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
So any picture form is out of life, not out of machine.
Right. Okay. This has been extremely helpful and enlightening for me, Brian. Once again, thank you for kind of agreeing to help us on our journey down in Tasmania here to kind of build resources for people to better understand and work with these processes. So we might wrap up here for now. At least I'm hoping you'll be open in future for me coming knocking on your door. But thank you for offering your time and your wisdom for the development of this resource for our members.
Thank you, Trevor.